This program is a presentation of UCTV for educational and non-commercial use only.
So welcome. I'm Kim Barrett, Dean of Graduate Studies and a professor in the School of Medicine at the University of California, San Diego. It's my pleasure to have in studio my colleague, renowned physiologist John B. West, to discuss his storied career investigating respiratory physiology. John's career spans pioneering work in understanding respiration and research efforts in the highest places on Earth and indeed in space. Your interests in science when you were growing up in Adelaide were really quite different from what you finally ended up pursuing. Tell me a little bit about how your interest in science began in your high school career and how you turned eventually to physiology.
Well, as you said, I was brought up in Adelaide in Australia, and I was lucky enough to go to a good high school there where we had a wonderful science master. And he had an enormous influence on my life. I always like to mention that because I think people often underestimate the influence of teachers at a relatively early level. And this was Ray Smith, and his interest was in physics mainly, and I became extremely interested in high energy physics, particle physics. The cyclotron had been invented a few years before, and I was very interested in that. Invented, I might say, at UC Berkeley, and it's rather strange they ended up at the same university. So I was particularly interested in high energy physics. But in the event, after leaving high school, I went to medical school at the University of Adelaide, the only university in South Australia. I'm not quite sure why I did that. It may have been the fact that my father was a doctor and my mother was a nurse probably wasn't irrelevant. But anyway, I did my medical degree there.
You moved on to really pursue a research career from medicine. So what was the transition there? Why did you decide to go into research rather than into practice?
I was always interested in research, particularly, as I said, in physics. And after finishing my medical degree in Adelaide and doing the necessary residency, I moved to London. That was quite common at the time. There were very strong ties between Australia and the UK, and postgraduate medical studies were not well developed in Adelaide at that time. Of course they are now, quite different now. But I moved to London. I've always been an Anglophile, and so I wanted to see London anyway, and I had lots and lots of friends in London. And after a year or two, I managed to get into an institution called the Postgraduate Medical School, part of London University, and that had lots of lots of young doctors from abroad, from the Commonwealth, from Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa at that time, India, and so on. So, and a wonderful place to be, a very high academic standard. And it turned out that I spent 15 years on and off at the Postgraduate Medical School, and that's where I did all my original research. I knew I was interested in physical phenomena, pressures, flows, resistances, that kind of thing. And so it was natural to go into something like either cardiovascular medicine or respiratory medicine. And it turned out that they were developing a big program in respiratory medicine at Hammersmith Hospital, which is where the Postgraduate Medical School was. And so I went actually to a Medical Research Council unit where I learnt some more respiratory physiology, and I returned to the Postgraduate Medical School, and I was extremely lucky in what happened there.
So I think that this actually, in some ways, the research that you carried out there linked back to your early interest in the cyclotron.
That's right, and that's a very curious thing. As a matter of fact, when I was in the final year of high school, we started a Prince Alfred College, which was the name of the high school, Prince Alfred College Science Journal, and I was the first editor. And I had to write an article, so I wrote it on the cyclotron. And oddly enough, when I got to the postgraduate medical school, a number of years later, of course, after doing medicine, I found that the Medical Research Council cyclotron, which was the first cyclotron ever that had been especially produced for medical research, that came online. And I happened to be at the right place at the right time. It was actually, I believe, introduced first for neutron therapy, but that never amounted to much, I believe. But at the same time, it also produced these very short-lived radioisotopes, particularly an isotope called oxygen-15, which has a half-life of only 2 minutes. And that means that half of it decays, disappears in every 2 minutes because of disintegration. So it's a very remarkable isotope. And I can remember vividly a meeting where John McMichael, who was chairman of medicine, he said, well, we've got this cyclotron here, it's producing radioactive oxygen. Can anybody think of something to do with it? And so we said, we'll inhale it, which we did. And when we inhaled it and had counters arranged over different regions of the lung, to our astonishment, we found that the rate at which the radioactive gas was removed from the counting field was much greater at the bottom of the lung than the top of the lung, upright, normal subjects. That was a great surprise to us, and this was the first clear demonstration of the gradual reduction in blood flow as you go from the bottom of the lung to the top. And so I became very interested not only in that, because it turned out to be quite important from all sorts of points of view, not only physiology, but clinical aspects as well. And I then spent the next few years looking at the effects of gravity on the lung.
So this theme of gravity, John, that you had investigated so elegantly with the radioactive oxygen, actually spills over into much of your subsequent work in the field of respiratory physiology. And you became interested in what at the time, I guess, was a very, the early forays into space. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yes, that's so. So in the middle 60s, we became aware of the fact that the space program was very active. Early days, of course. Neil Armstrong didn't land on the moon until 1969, but I thought it might be very interesting to try and get a foot in the door in the space program and see what happens in the absence of gravity, which is what happens in space.
Sure.
And so I applied. I had one link with the US space program, a man called John Billingham, who was at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, eventually, and moved to Ames. And I applied for a fellowship with him, and so spent a year at the Ames Research Center, which is up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and became familiar to some extent with the space program. At that time, I put in a proposal to measure pulmonary function in space, although it wasn't at all clear when that would be done. And eventually, we did carry out a very large program, mainly on Spacelab in the 1990s, much later, but we developed an enormous amount of material on a lot of interesting research on the effects of weightlessness on pulmonary function, which of course affects the function of the lung a lot, but as we showed, it's not really going to limit the ability of astronauts, at least over periods we think of 2 or 3 years.
Doing research in space is obviously very challenging, and I think the story that you've just told shows a remarkable degree of scientific patience. You first started to think about these experiments in the 1960s, and yet the sort of fruition of the project really didn't come about till the 1990s on Spacelab. How were you able to sustain your interest in the field over that long period of time?
Well, you're quite right. You need a lot of patience to do work in space. We actually I put in the proposal in 1968. And the proposal was funded, and actually, as we'll hear later, I came to UCSD in 1969, and the first funding I had on the day I arrived, as a matter of fact, the funding from NASA arrived. And incidentally, we were continuously funded by NASA from 1969 until the end of 2006. So that, of course, was wonderful funding, and that's one of the reasons why I remained interested in the topic.
Yes.
But from a scientific point of view, it remained a tremendous interest. We weren't actually able to run the main experiments on Spacelab until the 1990s, but we were able to do some work using parabolic flight. That is, the aircraft flies up and goes over the top, and your stomach comes into your mouth, you know. And we did that on a NASA Learjet at the Ames Research Center up in Moffett Field. So we were able to do some preliminary work there, but really most of the work we did was on the Space Lab in the 1990s. So, as I said before, you've got to be very patient if you're going to work in the space program.
Yeah, I think that's a really important message when people work at the cell culture and the molecular biology level, and you can do an experiment in the morning and get the results in the afternoon. And I think that tenacity is a really important quality in science.
And you know, it works the other way as well. We had a number of graduate students who would like to have worked on space-related projects, but we always told them that's not a good bet because everything is so drawn out that it's just not going to be practicable. So why don't you go and work with Dr. Barrett on her Petri dishes?
So another aspect of your work that really relates to this theme of gravity has been your work on high altitude respiratory physiology. And this really dates back to your time in the 60s in London and the opportunity that you had to become involved in an expedition to the Himalayas. How did you get involved in the so-called Silver Hut expedition, and were you interested in mountaineering prior to this?
Well, again, that was a very serendipitous event. I've already mentioned the availability of radioactive oxygen. But what happened in the early 60s is that I happened to be sitting next to somebody at one of the meetings of the Physiological Society in London, at your old medical school, by the way, University College London. And I was sitting next to somebody, and she said to me, did I know that Griffith Pugh, who was a physiologist in London, was organizing a research expedition to the Himalayas? I said, no, I didn't know that. I'd heard of Pugh because he was the physiologist on the first ascent of Everest in 1953 with Hillary and Tenzing. Pugh was a physiologist and did a lot of work on that expedition. But on a whim, I got in touch with Pugh and said, I'm a young physiologist. I'm now well trained in respiratory physiology. Is there a place for me on the expedition? And to my great surprise, he said yes. Griff, as we called him, liked to have young acolytes around him, I think, and there were several of us who went on that expedition. Of course, one of the interesting things was that the expedition was actually run by Sir Edmund Hillary. It was a combined mountaineering and scientific expedition. The idea was they were going to try and climb a mountain called Makalu, which is the 6th highest mountain in the world. But during the winter, a group of physiologists would spend a period in this so-called Silver Hut at an altitude of 19,000 feet, very high. In fact, at the time, we thought that probably nobody had spent so long so high before. So it wasn't at all clear that that would be feasible, but we were able to do it. But of course, Hillary wanted to meet me if I was going to be on his expedition. So I met him in London, and the story I tell is that I'd never been on a mountain before, I should say. I'd done some skiing, but I'd never been high on a mountain before. And he asked me about that, and he was a little bit surprised, but then he said, would you walk up that flight of stairs? And I did that, and he said, well, that's okay. So I joined that expedition. It was a wonderful expedition. It took place in the fall of 1960 through until the end of the spring of 1961. In the fall of 1960, this Silver Hut was carried in to a region just south of Everest, about 10 miles south of Everest, and erected, as I said, at an altitude of 19,000 feet. And a group of about 8 physiologists spent the winter there working quite hard on physiology. I mean, basically what we wanted to know was, how does the body respond to such a high altitude for such a long period of time?
Yeah.
When lowlanders like ourselves go to high altitude, a whole series of adaptations take place called acclimatization, and it had never been studied in lowlanders, as we call them, at such a high altitude for such a long period before. And we got a wealth of new data. I mean, it was a very important expedition at the time, by far the most ambitious high altitude expedition at that time. And so we got a lot of data during that time. And then in the spring, the climbers came back. They'd been off in New Zealand swimming or whatever. They came back in the spring. We moved across to this mountain Makalu, which, as I say, is I think the 6th highest mountain in the world, 5th or 6th. Tried to climb it without supplementary oxygen. We weren't successful because one of the climbers, a New Zealander, got extremely ill, and we had a hard time getting him off the mountain alive. But we also managed to do some physiology very high, including some measurements of maximal exercise at an altitude of over 24,000 feet, the highest measurements that have been made. In fact, Mike Ward, one of my colleagues, and myself put together the bicycle ergometer, the stationary bicycle, on the Makalu Col at 24,000 feet, which incidentally amused the Sherpas a lot because they couldn't understand why you wanted to take a bicycle up to a high mountain like that. But we made these measurements, and so that had an enormous influence on my career. The expedition was very successful. I mean, there was a whole group of physiologists on it, but as one of them, I got a lot of good data, and of course I became very interested in extreme altitude. And at that time, and shortly after, I wondered whether it would ever be possible to make measurements at the highest point on Earth. I mean, that looked as though it might be becoming feasible, and,
yes.
And that was the original seed, which eventually flowered into the expedition in 1981.
So it's quite a picture to think about, this group of intrepid physiologists in this hut, so high up on the mountain in the winter. Tell me a little bit about how you spent your days. You mentioned that you worked very hard, but what exactly were you doing? Were you experimenting on each other? Were you collecting samples? And how did you spend your free time?
As I said, we worked quite hard. Of course, at that altitude, you can't do the normal 8-hour day. It's more like a 5 or 6 hour day, but we worked quite hard, as you say, experimenting on ourselves mainly. We were particularly interested in the responses of the body to exercise at that altitude, the changes in the lungs, the changes in the heart that occur at those great altitudes. And we had quite a lot of equipment in the Silver Hut. We had blood gas electrodes, for example, and we're measuring gas concentrations. So it was quite a sophisticated laboratory. It was actually in 3 parts. There was a series of bunks at one end, and then in the center there was a big stove which kept the thing warm, where we ate, and then at the other end there was the laboratory. So it was beautifully organized, and we worked very hard. Now, we did have some pleasure as well. Late in the afternoon we would go out and ski on the glacier. Of course, skiing up there is pretty hard work, because for 5 minutes skiing downhill, there's a half an hour slog uphill, you know, no lift. So that was quite hard work. And you're, of course, very short of breath. People often ask, you know, what's it like living at an altitude like that? Well, the answer is that it's very unpleasant because you're short of breath the whole time. For example, even if you sit up in bed in your bunk, you have to pant for 2 or 3 minutes afterwards. Just the effort of sitting up in your bunk requires, you have to recover from that. So you're very short of breath, and we lost a lot of weight. We lost in the order of something like 1 to 2 pounds a week, a tremendous rate of weight loss. And one of the interesting things is that we were at this altitude of 19,000 feet. We had a base camp at about 15,000 feet, which of course is pretty high. It's higher than you can get in the Sierras, for example. But the odd thing was that when we went down from the Silver Hut to the base camp, which we did occasionally, we felt as though we were going to sea level.
Yeah.
It's very interesting, and that those great altitudes, even 1,000 feet, makes a tremendous difference in how you feel. Mm-hmm. So it was a very successful expedition, and we all got on pretty well. That was the other remarkable thing. There were about 8 of us, and there were very few personal problems. We got on very well, and it, of course, was an unforgettable experience.
The weight loss is a fascinating thing. Is that, do you think, that you were expending more calories than you could possibly take in? I know from my own experience when I've gone to far more modest altitudes, your sleep is very disrupted. Did you get any insights into that, or were you mostly focusing on the respiratory and cardiovascular physiology?
We did some work on weight loss, although I'm not sure that we found the precise answers, but I can say that, first of all, the calorie expenditure wasn't enormously high. At those altitudes, you can't move very fast, and so apart from a bit of skiing, we were active, but we weren't working very hard. We had plenty of food. We had mainly freeze-dried food, which was had just been introduced shortly before that. It wasn't the greatest food, but we had plenty of it, so there was no restriction in that way. Of course, appetite is greatly reduced at high altitude. That's one of the things that fails. And also, as you said, sleep. Sleep is very impaired at high altitude. And you get this periodic breathing, and people wake a lot during the night. There was some evidence, actually, that absorption of food was impaired. And that, I think, is part of the problem. I think, and it's your area, the gut does not like operating under those conditions of extreme hypoxia, oxygen deprivation. But that's not been fully worked out. But there was some evidence that food absorption was impaired.
Of course, the gut is a relatively hypoxic organ at sea level, so I can imagine that would be really an issue. So, well, fascinating questions that maybe could be answered on a subsequent expedition. And indeed, you did go back to the mountains, as you mentioned, in the early 80s for the Everest expedition, which was really quite extraordinary. Tell me what the major scientific accomplishments were on that expedition and how it came about.
Well, as I said, having been on the Silver Hut expedition, which was very successful in terms of scientific discoveries, I, of course, had a strong interest in high altitude, and that continued. And I'd always wondered whether it might be possible to organize an expedition to get measurements on the summit of Mount Everest. I mean, that looks like a nice endpoint, you know. And so in the late 70s, it looked as though that might become feasible. And in fact, in 1981, we ran what we call the American Medical Research Expedition to Everest, or AMRE as we called it. That was run here out of UCSD. And that was a very ambitious expedition. We had 3 groups of people on it. We had the climbers, first of all, who put in the route to the summit. They were climbers who'd been to 8,000 meter peaks before, very high. Most of them had been in the Himalayas before climbing. We had a group called the climbing scientists. These were all physiologists with interest in high altitude physiology, but they were all strong climbers as well. And finally, we had the scientists themselves, physiologists, who ran the laboratories. We had laboratories at the base camp on Everest from the south side, the Nepalese side. That's at an altitude of about 17,500 feet. And then we had a big laboratory at 21,000 feet above the Icefall, which is a very unpleasant part of the route. And we were very lucky. Lots of people go to Mount Everest and they don't get to the summit. Depends on weather to a large extent.
Or don't come back at all in some cases.
Or they don't come back at all, that's right. But we were a very lucky expedition. First of all, we had no serious illnesses on the expedition. But apart from that, we had good weather late in October in 1981, and we managed to have 5 people reach the summit, 2 Sherpas and 3 Westerners. And one of them, Dr. Chris Pizzo, was actually here at the Scripps Clinic as a pathologist. He summited on October 24, 1981, and made quite a number of measurements on the summit, including the first measurements of barometric pressure. Of course, we had a pretty good idea what it would be, but nevertheless, it was nice to get the first direct measurement, which was, in fact, somewhat higher than we had expected. And he took alveolar gas samples. In other words, he breathed out into a special piece of equipment that we had designed and built here, and we collected the last expired gas and brought it back to UCSD for analysis. And he made a whole series of other measurements as well. He had a Holter monitor, that's a device for measuring the electrocardiogram, running, named, I might say, after Norman Holter, who used to be a resident of La Jolla here. and a lot of other measurements as well. So it was a very successful expedition, and again, by far the most ambitious expedition up to that time. In fact, very few measurements have been made at these extreme altitudes since then, and really no measurements on the summit have been made since then. So we're waiting for the next group to go along and do them.
I think that the things that you've described about the expedition would make it quite daunting for anybody to take this on, especially, as we've already talked about, in an era where people demand quick results. The planning for an expedition like that must have been extraordinary.
It was extraordinary, and I have to say that in 1981, the requirements for human subjects, which are so stringent now, the audience might not know this, but in order to make measurements on human subjects, even yourselves now, there's a tremendous amount of paperwork that has to be gone through. It's got to go through a human subjects committee and so on. Well, of course, we did that, but in those days it was a much less arduous process. So I'm sure that some of the things we did then probably wouldn't be allowed now. In fact, we got a grant from the NIH to support some of the work. The hardest part of the expedition, incidentally, was raising the money for
Yes.
it. But we got a grant from the NIH. It did not get a good priority. The priority it got, the score it got from the study section, would never be funded these days. And oddly enough, 2 or 3 people, I think it was 3 people, voted against the project because they said it was too dangerous. And NIH money should not be used for such a dangerous activity. Of course, now if you get 3 people voting against a project, you can't possibly get it funded. But
yes.
We just managed to get it funded, and that was critical. We were a very lucky expedition, because if it hadn't been funded, that was in the late 70s sometime, we would never have been able to do the expedition. I should say that we had a couple of very remarkable events on the expedition, which I don't have time to tell you about in detail, but one of them was that Chris Pizzo, whom I mentioned, the pathologist at Scripps here, when he came on October 24 to make the final ascent to the summit, he couldn't find his ice axe. It had been blown away or something, we don't know. So he picked up a tent pole and started heading for the summit with that. Now, there's no way you can get to the summit of Mount Everest with a tent pole. After he'd been climbing for about an hour, he found an ice axe on the ice in front of him. And it turned out it was the ice axe of somebody who died on the mountain some 2 years before. It had been rattling around on the mountain for 2 years and fetched up on the ice in front of Chris Pizzo. Very remarkable event. The other remarkable thing was that Peter Hackett, one of our other summiters, who also made measurements very high, Peter made a solo summit attempt. I don't have time to tell you about that, but remarkable story. Extremely dangerous, in fact, foolhardy thing to do. But he he climbed solo to the summit. On the way back, he fell in a very difficult pitch called the Hillary Step. Usually people fall about 8,000 feet to their certain death, of course. He fell about 10 or 12 feet, got one of his boots caught in a piece of outcropping rock, found himself upside down near the summit of Mount Everest, completely alone, with the evening coming on. He was thrashing around with his ice axe, and he found a piece of rope that had been put in that in that difficult pitch by some previous expedition, we don't know who, and he managed to extricate himself and meet Chris Pizzo, who was waiting for him, and got down. So we were a very, very lucky expedition altogether.
Truly extraordinary. So John, obviously on the Everest expedition, you were able to make measurements and do studies considerably higher than you had in the Silver Heart expedition. Did you find different things? What types of different measurements were you able to make, in that the science had probably moved on over the intervening period?
Yes, I think that's an interesting question. The scientific objective of the Silver Heart expedition was to look at the acclimatization process in people who normally live at sea level over a long period of time, several months, about 5 months, at a very high altitude, 19,000 feet. The Everest expedition in '81 had a different purpose. The idea there was to look again at lowlanders and see if we could understand how they can possibly get to the summit of Mount Everest, what changes take place. And I should perhaps add to that that there was a lot of controversy at the time as to whether humans could ever reach the summit of Mount Everest, particularly without supplementary oxygen. Of course, Hillary did it with oxygen in 1953, but the mountain wasn't climbed without supplementary oxygen until 1978 by two European climbers, Messner and Hubler. In fact, that's an interesting statistic because back in 1924, two climbers got to within 300 meters of the summit without supplementary oxygen, but the mountain actually wasn't climbed without supplementary oxygen for another 54 years. So that indicates how close you are to the limits of tolerance.
Yeah.
And that's the reason why, apart from the fact that it's the highest point on Earth, from a physiological, medical point of view, it's so fascinating because it's very, very close to the limit of oxygen tolerance. Only 100 people or so have reached the summit of Everest without supplementary oxygen. It still remains an extremely difficult thing to do. So we were very interested in exactly what does the body do? What changes allow you to survive at these extreme altitudes? And one of the most important things we found was the increase in breathing, the hyperventilation, is absolutely critical. In fact, we measured the, again a little bit technical here, the carbon dioxide partial pressure in the lungs from these measurements that Pizzo did on the summit, measuring alveolar gas, or sampling alveolar gas, and we found that the carbon dioxide level fell from the normal value of 40 down to 8. So there was a 5-fold increase in ventilation on the summit, tremendous increase in breathing. And unless you're able to mount such an enormous hyperventilation, give up any hope of climbing Mount Everest, take up gardening or something like that, because you're not going to get to the summit of Mount Everest. So that was a very surprising finding. I did not expect the degree of hyperventilation to be so great. And incidentally, Pizzo also recorded a tape on the summit. One of the interesting problems we had was, how's he going to record the information? For example, the barometric pressure. We had a nice barometer and he was going to measure that. And one of the first things he did when he got to the summit was tell us what the pressure was, 253 millimeters of mercury. But we weren't going to let him just remember that. We thought that wasn't good enough. So we had several sophisticated ways of doing it. But in fact, the way he did it was simply to record in the tape recorder. And the tape sounds like a patient in the last stages of respiratory failure. I mean, Pizzo had to take a breath between every 2 or 3 words. He was desperately short of breath on the summit. So that's a dramatic, just a colourful indication of what we were able to show with the measurements of carbon dioxide.
So John, you came back from the Everest expedition, obviously with a wealth of data still to analyze, but this was also a time when you were moving more actively into the culmination of the plans you had to conduct research in space. Tell me a little bit about the experiments on the Space Lab. Did you have a bicycle ergometer in the Space Lab flying around? Exactly what was done on the Space Lab, and what did you find out?
Yes, well, the Space Lab experiments themselves are very dramatic. The remarkable thing about the Space Lab experiments, of course, is that the astronauts are doing these up in space, but we were down in the Johnson Space Center in Houston monitoring what they were doing. And it's remarkable because most of the monitoring you can do in real time. The data's streaming down and you can see the experiment. It's just as if the astronaut was doing the experiment in the room, you know. So it's more or less the same. So it's a very striking feature, and we're able to get an enormous amount of data very, very quickly. Of course, we wrote a number of papers about this. I should say that, you know, we started working, we got this funding initially in 1969, and so we weren't just sitting on our heels waiting for the Space Lab to come along. We were doing quite a lot of work in between, and in the 70s, I think it was, we started doing the parabolic flights, and we got quite a lot of data that way. And that, in a sense, also was helping to plan the eventual measurements on Space Lab. Because when I put in the application to measure pulmonary function on humans in space, it wasn't at all clear where that would be done. At that time, there was no thought of Space Lab, and so that was that came along much later. But Space Lab was a wonderful facility. I'm very sorry that it's been disbanded, as a matter of fact, but it has. And now, of course, the experiments have moved to Space Station. We've had a couple experiments on Space Station, but it's Space Station is a very expensive thing to keep up, and unfortunately, NASA work at the present time, medical work is at a bit of a low ebb, I would say.
Mm-hmm. So the precise types of experiments you did, the astronauts were exercising and you were taking samples, making measurements?
Yes. Basically, what we were trying to determine is to what extent does the weightlessness of space affect pulmonary function, including their ability to exercise. So that's right, we had a bicycle ergometer up there, and we held a whole series of pulmonary function tests, not actually very unlike these tests that are done in a pulmonary function laboratory at a hospital, for example, here at the Thornton or the VA hospital. Same kinds of measurements are made, and we got a wealth of data. And the work I did was with Dr. Kim Prisk, who ran the NASA lab, and Kim and I, if I can be modest, wrote the book on pulmonary function in space. I mean, not often you have a chance to write a book on a new area of activity, but that's what we did. And we largely sorted out, I think, the problems of pulmonary function in first of all, in short flights of 2 weeks or so, then a more extended period, 3 months or so in Space Station. And I think we can confidently say that, for example, on a trip to Mars and back, pulmonary function is not going to be a serious problem, which is what NASA wants to hear, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. So your work in these extreme environments, John, has really brought you renown in many, many countries of the world, and obviously has many practical applications. I believe you've been working with mine workers at high altitude in Chile, and I know there have been other places where your expertise that you've gained from these expeditions has been used. Tell me a bit about those efforts.
Yes, I've maintained an interest in high altitude because it's a very important subject. I mean, some people, when you say high altitude, think it's very exotic and doesn't mean much to most people, but actually a very large number of people live at high altitude. I actually edit a journal on high altitude medicine and biology, and a lot of the articles we get are about the so-called highlanders, people who live permanently at high altitude, mainly in the South American Andes or on the Tibetan Plateau. And I might say that a lot of those people get sick. There are various diseases that occur at high altitude. They've not been studied as much as they should be because they tend to be populations of a low socioeconomic status. They haven't attracted the attention that they should have done, and so that's an interesting area itself. I've been very interested actually in a new technique which we developed about 10 or so years ago, and that was mainly to help people who have to work at a high altitude. It was particularly people in telescopes. There are astronomers now who work at about 5,000 meters. That's about 16,500 feet, very high, mainly in North Chile. There's a big plateau in North Chile just east of the Atacama Desert at about 5,000 meters. It's actually very interesting because you can drive up to that extremely high altitude. It's amazing that you can do that because it's in the tropics. Yeah. It's not very far from the equator, actually. And it's a favorite place for telescopes. And I became interested in ways of improving the quality of life at that altitude because you can't think straight at those altitudes. People go up there, they make all sorts of calculations, they come down to sea level, they find they're all wrong, you know. So what we do now is we actually generate oxygen from the air and we feed it into the air conditioning of the rooms. And so we raise the oxygen concentration from its normal value of 21%, which is what it is here, to, at that altitude, 27%. Doesn't sound like a lot, but for every 1% that you raise the oxygen concentration, you reduce the equivalent altitude by about 1,000 feet. So it's actually very effective. So that's being done now in a number of facilities. A very large telescope is presently being built at this site. And that's being done in a number of places all over the world now, so-called oxygen enrichment of room air. Mm-hmm. Now, a very interesting thing happened in September of last year. I was invited by the Ministry of Railways of China to advise them on their high-altitude train, which they've built, that goes to Lhasa, the capital of Tibet. I'd actually visited them 2 or 3 times before and talked about the possibility of oxygen enrichment of the train. Because for the last 14 hours of the train ride to Lhasa, the average altitude is about 4,500 meters, going up to 5,000 meters. 4,500 meters is, I don't know, about 15,000 feet, yep. Goes up to about 16,500 feet. So very, very high. So high that people are definitely at risk from oxygen deprivation at those altitudes. So the Chinese thought about this a lot, and they decided to oxygen enrich the whole train. I thought it would be impossible. I thought from an engineering point of view, I mean, oxygen enriching a room is one thing, oxygen enrich a whole train is something else. But they've been able to do it. They've got an oxygen generator in every carriage, every passenger car. They've got gas-tight connections between the cars. The gangways are gas-tight. Mm-hmm. And I took a trip on the train in September of last year, and you can go from one passenger car to another, and you can actually read what the oxygen concentration in the air is. It's on a panel there, and it's a very remarkable technological advance. So I take my hat off to the engineers who did that. Actually, it was mainly designed by a group called Bombardier in Montreal, with their Chinese counterparts. And it's a very remarkable engineering achievement, I think.
Hopefully, given the effects that oxygen deprivation has on mental function, they also enrich the cabin of the driver of the train.
Yes, they do. And one of the things next time I go on the train, I'll try to see if I can ride on the footplate of the thing. I never asked them to do that. But I know they use oxygen as well.
So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about your time here at UC San Diego, because you were one of the founding faculty for what was really quite a brave experiment in medical education, a new medical school with new ways of doing things. Tell me how you ended up at UC San Diego and some of your experiences in the time you've been here.
Well, let me start by telling you how I got here, which is, again, rather serendipitous. I was at the NASA Ames Research Center in 1967-68, and in the summer of '68, I went to a conference in Aspen. They have them every year on pulmonary problems, pulmonary medicine. And while I was there, during the coffee break in the morning, I remember it vividly, Dr. Avril Liebau, who was a very eminent pathologist, came up to me and said, did I know there was a new medical school about to be started at UC San Diego? I said I didn't know. In fact, I didn't know much about San Diego because, you know, in those days, San Diego, at least as far as I was concerned, was not an academic center, you know. But he said, yes, that's going to take place. So he told Eugene Brownwood, who was the first chairman of medicine here, and he invited me down from Moffett Field, and eventually I decided to come to this new medical school. It looked like a wonderful opportunity. I could see immediately from meeting the relatively few people who'd been recruited that it was going to be an absolutely first-class medical school. You say I was the founding faculty. I did teach the first-year class. I taught the first-year medical class in the winter of 1969, but I was not a member of the people who designed the medical school. That was a different group. But I had the opportunity of seeing the first-year class, and of course now, 40 years later, the remarkable changes. And I must say it's been a wonderful opportunity to be here. I'm enormously grateful that I was able to come to this wonderful medical school, wonderful campus for that matter, and the opportunities were absolutely remarkable. I couldn't have done what I've done if I'd not come to UCSD.
I know that, as you mentioned, you've taught that first-year class and many, many, many subsequent classes, and teaching's been an important part of your career. I know how important it is to you from having worked with you directly. You've written, or wrote many years ago, a textbook of respiratory physiology that has been used all over the world. What inspired you to write that book?
Yes, well, that's an interesting topic, because when I came to UCSD, I found I had to teach undergraduate medical students, and I'd never done that before. There were plenty of students at the postgraduate medical school in London where I worked, but they were all postgraduate. They all had medical degrees. So to teach students who were just embarking on medicine was something quite new. I immediately recognized that it was interesting, but it was very challenging, because I hadn't thought of ways to do this. And one of the things I realized when I started teaching the course was that there wasn't, at least in my opinion, an appropriate textbook for the first year medical student doing respiratory physiology. Respiratory physiology is often difficult for medical students because it's very, there are lots of equations, it's very numerical, very mathematical in some areas, and a number of students find that difficult. So I decided to write a textbook, which I did, and it's been very, very successful. I think one of the reasons it's very short, but it's been very successful, being translated into 13 languages. It's used all over the world, and it's still going strong. I might say some of the languages, some of the translations were pirated. I remember an occasion when I had a gentleman from Isfahan came to see me, and he'd made a translation into Farsi, into Persian, and he gave me a copy of it, beautiful to see, of course, in Farsi, very like Arabic, and start at the back, work through to the front, and so on. And he said, "I'm sure you'll be glad to see that." Well, I said, "I'm quite glad." He said, "But did you get permission to do it?" "Oh, no."
Did you ask him for some royalties?
Exactly. There were no royalties on that one.
Yeah.
But
Well,
I'm delighted that they're using it in, anyone who uses it, I'm just delighted, yeah.
Well, it's a wonderful book, and it's not surprising that it has gone through so many editions and so many translations.
Well, let me add, Kim, that I think you've written a book along the same, rather similar lines.
Well, I was very inspired by yours, that's for sure. One of the other professional activities that you've been involved with for a number of years is to be involved with the American Physiological Society. Indeed, you served as its president and in many other capacities. And the society is a bedrock of medical education, the discipline of physiology. There's still very many important research questions to be answered, but in some ways people feel that physiology may be a sort of poor relation to some of the newer molecular disciplines. What advice might you have for the council of the APS at the current time in promoting the discipline of physiology, and any other advice you'd like to give the current leadership?
Well, you're quite right. I think physiology over the last few years has been in a difficult phase, partly because of the dramatic advances in molecular medicine and molecular biology, and nobody can deny that. I mean, the whole human genome work and so on is terribly exciting. There's no question about that. But physiology remains the cornerstone of the intelligent practice of medicine. Any young medical doctor who goes out and treats a patient with pulmonary disease has to have a good basis in pulmonary physiology. There's just no question about that. And the same is true of cardiovascular or GI or any other kind of medicine. So there's no doubt that physiology will remain the bedrock of the intelligent practice of medicine. So I don't think we need to worry about the ultimate future of physiology. At present, or in the past few years, it's to some extent been eclipsed by these other absolutely dramatic advances, but it still remains a very, very important subject. It'll never go away. It'll never go away. Now, the American Physiological Society, of course, has been an absolutely wonderful organization. It has promoted physiology in this country now for over 100 years. Its research, the stimulation of research, Also, the publications. You as chairman of the Publications Committee know this very well. It's one of the great medical science publishers in the country, and it produces a whole series of very important journals, and it's made a tremendously important mark on the discipline and on the progress of medicine in this country and indeed throughout the world. So it can be very proud of the work it's done. I was fortunate, I think, to be elected president in I think it was 1985, as I recall. I think the fact that I'd been on the expedition didn't hurt, and the fact that I had a textbook that was used by a lot of people didn't hurt either. But I was very fortunate to be elected president, and I've enormously enjoyed my association with the American Physiological Society.
Well, the Society's been very lucky to have you as such an important member. Another major goal for the Society is really to promote the careers of young scientists. And what advice might you have to somebody who's in high school right now thinking about science, influenced by perhaps a gifted science teacher? Would you advise such a young person to follow in your footsteps in a research career?
I think that physiology is still a wonderful career. There's no question about it. Of course, I've been perhaps fortunate in the fact that my career has been a little bit more colorful than most people would have. I mean, certainly it's a little bit unusual to have the experiences at extreme altitude and also in space. That's very difficult to do. In fact, I should just perhaps mention that space medicine physiology at the present time is at a low ebb, unfortunately, and is a very difficult field to work in, partly because it's just so expensive. I mean, it's a very, very difficult discipline to work in. But I think physiology is a wonderful area. As I said before, it's never going to go away. There are still lots of things to be learnt in all the organ systems. I mean, I'm sure you would agree that in the gastrointestinal system, there are lots and lots of unanswered questions. So I think my advice to young people would be that if physiology attracts you, by all means go into it. Of course, it has become more molecular, and I think people look at me. I have a son who's a pathologist at Stanford Medical School, and I think he regards the kind of work I do as pretty old-fashioned, you know, because he's very molecular, like most young people. But there is still a place for non-molecular physiology. For example, at the present time, I'm very interested in the comparative physiology, the difference between the lungs of birds and mammals. It turns out to be an absolutely fascinating area which has not been completely explored. It can be argued that the avian lung is superior to the mammalian lung in many respects. It's a fascinating story because the two classes of vertebrates, both of whom are capable of very high sustained levels of activity, the only two classes of vertebrates are the birds and the mammals. And although many features of the physiology of both are similar, the lungs are radically different. The birds have developed a completely different respiratory apparatus. The birds have separated the gas exchange from the ventilatory function, which actually makes all the sense in the world. And I gave a lecture a little while ago with the title, The Human Lung, Did Evolution Get It Wrong? And you know, it's partly a provocative statement, but you can make a case that evolution actually took a better path for the bird lung than for the mammalian lung. Now you may say, well, what's that got to do with human disease? Well, it is linked in a way. I mean, by looking at other types of lungs and understanding other solutions to the whole problem of gas exchange, that gives you insights into the human lung and the way it goes wrong.
Sure. And maybe strategies to put it right.
And maybe strategies, yes.
So John, you've approached most of the research through your career from a starting point of sort of understanding the basic principles of respiratory physiology. But of course, the work that you've done has really contributed not only to that basic understanding, but also to clinical medicine and understanding what goes wrong in patients with respiratory diseases. Could you tell us a little bit about the application of your work and how the field has advanced due to the discoveries that you've made?
I could say a little bit about that. First of all, the work we did on the distribution of blood flow and other effects of gravity on the lung has a lot of implications, particularly in the intensive care unit when people are critically ill. Mm-hmm. But there are many, many aspects of medicine where that plays an important role, so that was important. Of course, people always want to ask, particularly about the Everest or the space program, particularly about the high altitude program, tell me an important medical finding that has come out of this. Mm. And you know, the answer to that, unfortunately, is there's no specific breakthrough that you can point your finger to. And that's not the way medical research works. You and I both know that. I mean, medical research works by people planning careful experiments, asking an important question, making careful measurements, and writing it up and distributing it to the community. And gradually, medical research advances. It's very unusual for someone to make a sudden, important, stepwise change. And I don't think that I can point to one, actually. I mean, it's a gradual process of increase in knowledge. Respiratory medicine has changed out of all recognition over the 50 years that I've been involved in it. And the same is true of respiratory physiology. I was in it at a very good time. There was a big increase in knowledge during World War II. That's always the case, by the way, for respiratory physiology medicine. A war always makes a big difference because people are exposed in aircraft to oxygen deprivation, high accelerations, whatever, and so there's always a big increase in research. And that certainly took place during World War II. That was before my time, before my professional time, but enormous advances made, particularly in this country, by physiologists. And then after World War II, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, tremendous increases in what we know about the lung. Mm-hmm. Just to take one small example, people became aware of the importance of surface tension in the lung in the 50s. And they realized that babies born without what's called surfactant develop the respiratory distress syndrome and are likely to die. Over the course of my lifetime, I never worked on it, but over the course of my lifetime, I've seen the whole of this area understood. I've seen the therapy of this disease developed, and now, you know, most of these children survive, these infants survive reasonably well. So, I mean, that's just an example of the rapid pace of advance. Yeah. So the last 50 years have been dramatic in terms of pulmonary disease.
And of course, without your fundamental work in physiology, there wouldn't be building blocks to make those subsequent discoveries on.
Absolutely.
Well, John, it's been a real pleasure speaking to you about your illustrious career. It reads like a novel, as they say. It's a beautiful story. And so I just want to close by thanking you very much for taking the time to speak to me today on behalf of UC San Diego and also the American Physiological Society. It's truly been a pleasure.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure talking to you.